So, Hugh, we had this thing here in the States where if you talk to an old American, like yours truly, at some point the question will come up, well, where were you when President Kennedy was shot? For many young people that I know, their flashbulb memory, their moment was when the Twin Towers fell.
Dude, I was literally just thinking that. Yeah, I think we were on holiday in like Holland or something as a family, and yeah, crazy.
Yeah, and it's just seared into our memories as a moment in time. And the pandemic has been like that in some ways, and maybe not like it, because to me at least, it felt as the tsunami was building. For those of us who actually keep track of current events and maybe watch a little more news than is psychologically beneficial for us.
I feel like that's shots fired at my end. It's like this monastic podcaster that media fasts frequently. We'll get into that.
Media fast is not a common term thrown around in the Alardi household, but I remember back in January 2020 seeing the first glimpses of the tsunami on the horizon. Part of it's because I'm on medical Twitter, and yes, virology Twitter, and yes, epidemiology Twitter. And it was blowing up and people were losing their minds. And that got my attention. And then in February, the tsunami was building. And I remember clearly in late February, when there were only a handful of confirmed cases spreading in the community in the US. I remember telling my students in one of my classes, I don't want to alarm you, but I want this to be on your radar because based on everything I'm seeing, this is going to be a massive disruptive event. And I said, I hope to God I'm wrong, but I would not be at all surprised if we are finishing this semester from home.
Crazy.
And there were just looks of stunned disbelief. And I felt somewhat apologetic until 3 weeks later when all of us got the news. And this was the flashbulb moment for us. The university is shutting down for 2 weeks and we're going to finish the semester online. A lot of the students emailed and said, hey, Dr. Alardi, I thought you were crazy 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, okay, Dr. Dodd, whatever you say.
Yeah. And I'm like, that's okay. I get that a lot. But they said, thank you. This was so much easier to process, to digest, to take in. Just the fact that you put it on the radar somehow made it less awful. But it was a flashbulb moment. So I got to ask you, Hugh, what was it like for you? When did you know this pandemic was a thing?
Okay, so what I will say is, I guess I didn't have a Dr. Alardi in my life at the time because I was right up until the wire until I actually started taking this thing seriously. And like what I mean by that is like I remember celebrating New Year's Eve in Germany and like us toasting to the new year and kind of like laughing about this. Oh, do you hear this like this virus stuff that's happening? It's like, oh, you know what the media is like, blowing everything out of proportion as usual. And in February was my birthday, and we did all the birthday stuff, and it the pressure was building a little bit, but we were like, oh yeah, it'll definitely blow over, like it's no big deal. And then I remember memory's a funny thing; it gets a bit patchy, but somehow then like the jump cut then is to me like driving home from my studio in Belfast and listening to the radio, which is something that I never do because I was on the edge of my seat, like something is about to happen. And I felt like it was what my granny talks about, like some of the wars of like these like public service announcements. And there was like rumors that like the prime minister is going to do like a big speech at 8:00 and we're not on social media. And so, our neighbors were telling us and our colleagues were telling us. And I was like, dude, we got to find a way to listen to this speech. And I just remember sitting on the sofa in my living room with my wife, who was heavily pregnant at the time, and just listening to Boris Johnson tell us that the country is shutting down, we are not allowed to leave our houses, we're not allowed to go to work, and we are entering into a full lockdown. And I'm going to be honest, like, it completely blindsided me because I even remember my Google Calendar of that week. How sad. That's a real sad part from my end. But I remember like literally like on Friday, or a few days after that, I had a big interview plan with like a really famous rugby player in Ireland. I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, like I have not prepared for this in the slightest. So yeah, it took me completely by surprise.
So I have to ask, how do you cope with something like that? What were your go-to coping strategies? Not a personal question at all.
Yeah, so I mean, as I guess we'll get into in future episodes, my natural response to things is usually on either side of the spectrum. I either go really hyper and high energy. I go into like superhero mode, I've referred to it as to other people in my life, or I get depressed and I lay low and I'm very defeated. So the start of the pandemic, I launched into this like hero mode, and I was trying to make sense of the situation by focusing on the things that were inside my control. And I ended up doing like this huge 50-day podcast challenge on my own podcast, Best of Belfast, where basically I felt responsible to help get people through the lockdown. And we did like 50 days of an interview every single day. And at the same time, we launched a new podcast with Seth Godin's remote working community, and we were also putting out a podcast every day on that. So we did something like 100 episodes in 50 days. So went full manic mode into like, we're here to serve the nation, and we're here to like get people through their day and give them something to talk to. And we were interviewing people all around the planet, and some Irish people living in Italy at the time, which was really getting the brunt of it, if you remember back
absolutely
at the start of everything.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that inevitably led to kind of this crashing and burning where you can't sustain that for a long time. But yeah, I launched into hero mode to try and find meaning by serving other people, which I guess shows a lot of my own ego problems. But hey, I guess I wouldn't be in this industry if it wasn't for it.
I love it though. And it sounds like in a lot of ways that was really adaptive for you and for many of the people in your life, right? It had a downside eventually. It wasn't sustainable.
Yeah, well, I mean, but the crazy thing is, it kind of made the show, to be honest. You know, I still have people who reaching out and saying that was a really important time for them, and they listened to every episode, and you know, they did it on their 1 hour of exercise they were allowed to do outside of the house every single day. So, you know, it's like everything. Nothing is black or white. It's usually all very, very gray. So, yeah, interesting.
I love how it just shows who you are, though. And I was you asked me earlier, like, okay, so Steve, what was your go-to coping strategy? And the question really took me aback, because I had to recognize, like, I think when we face a crisis, we often want to lean into whatever we think our greatest strengths are. And for me, you know, I'm a researcher. I'm a clinician. I'm a scholar. So what did I lean into? Well, knowledge is power, right? I wanted to deeply understand what was happening, to deeply
I have this picture of you sitting there at home in your home office, and for some reason you bought 10 different screens, like a Wall Street stock trader, and you're like tracking all this stuff, and you've got a Twitter feed, and you've got like cases, like graphs going everywhere, and you're like scribbling notes. It's like, boom, this guy's in the control room right now.
It was not far off from that for a while. And, you know, I think just like in your experience, you went into hero mode. I went into the mode of an obsessed, somewhat compulsive scholar of the pandemic. And, you know, just like you said a minute ago, every strategy that we're going to use, there's no black and white. There are going to be strengths, there are going to be limitations. And one of the really exciting things for me today is that we're going to be talking about the connections between the pandemic and anxiety more broadly. And I think that really how both of us reacted initially, we're going to be able to come back to some of those things just as a ways of illustrating some broader principles that I think are going to be really helpful for our listeners, just in thinking through, like, what are the many, many connections between what we've been through, what we're still going through, and our level of anxiety? Because as everybody knows, anxiety is at all-time high levels in every advanced economy, every advanced society. And we want to help each of you think through what can I do? How can I be empowered to reduce my anxiety, to get to a better state of mental health?
Yeah, totally. And I guess like in both of our stories, particularly my example, I hope it gives a little bit of grace to people where, none of us reacted to this thing perfectly. It came out of the blue for me, not so much for Steve, but if you look at broadly speaking, like none of us were expecting this in October of 2019. And so we were kind of blindsided by this, and we would probably do things differently if we went back to it. But I'm excited to see some of the lessons that we can take from this as we kind of move forward to be a little bit stronger and more resilient, as the buzzword says, with
I love that word,
mental health. So look, I'm just going to jump in and do the intro. If you've been listening to us already, hello, big thank you for being here. Big welcome to Mental Health, the podcast where we discuss the latest tools, practices, and cutting edge research to help you take back control of your emotional well-being. My name is Hugh James. I'm a podcaster from Northern Ireland that has been on a journey towards healing from, I usually say addiction and depression, but I could just say like a plethora of mental conditions that we all face, and we're all on the spectrum. But really, it's been a 15-year journey for me, and I've been really grateful that over the last few years I've started to make some really serious headway for myself and my family. So yeah, lovely to have you here, and I'm excited to be here with you today, Steve, as well.
Outstanding. Yeah, thanks, Hugh. So yeah, I'm Steve Ilardi, and I never know how to introduce myself. I just want to say I'm a fellow traveler with all of you, but I'm a clinical psychologist, I'm a professor, I'm a researcher, I'm an author, and listen, we believe that mental health is the single most important foundation for living your best possible life, and that's our mission. Really, is to help you feel more equipped, more empowered, and more optimistic on your own journey. So today's episode is the second bit in a 4-part series on the pandemic. Last time we talked about the pandemic and depression. Today is all about anxiety, what it is, how it's connected to the pandemic, and then probably most importantly, what we can do to recover, to protect ourselves going forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, me, like I'm a big fan of definitions. So to kind of kick us off, or as a jumping off point, like let's get into it. Like from your clinical perspective, what actually is anxiety? We've talked before about, what actually is depression and some misconceptions. I actually think that anxiety has even more misunderstanding and confusion around what it actually is, because it for me feels a lot broader than the term depression. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so first things first, in the clinical world, believe it or not, we actually make a pretty key distinction between fear and anxiety.
Interesting.
Yeah. So fear, because that's the really easy one to define. Fear is the perception that there is something threatening that is immediately happening. In other words, the thing that I am dreading, it's going down right now. To put it in very, very primal terms, right? If you think about our ancestors who lived in a world filled potentially with actual physical predation, the tiger is right here.
Yeah, the snake is about to eat your child.
Exactly. And it's all going down right now. So what is fear? It is the perception of typically physical threat, physical danger, and the mobilizing of our body, our brain, our mind to deal with that threat. So in other words, everybody knows about the so-called fight or flight or freeze response. That's that big surge of adrenaline and blood sugar skyrocketing, that big surge of energy that we have to deal with a physical threat. Now, anxiety is a little different. It is much more the sense that there is a threat looming. It's not going down right now, but it could at any minute.
Yeah, I love how you, like, even when you were talking about fear there, I was like, okay, so like fear, and this is like completely twisting your definition, is almost like anxiety in the present moment, whereas anxiety is always future orientated. It's something that hasn't actually happened yet.
Yeah, but it's fear is also amplified. So in other words, the intensity is much, much higher. So in other words, with anxiety, typically, at least, our experience is like, so if we could just put our level of fear-based arousal, our fight or flight arousal on a 10-point scale, 0 to 10. So if we're relaxed, we're calm, we might be like a 0 or a 1. Fear at its highest level, we're a 10. It's like, there's a crazed madman wielding a knife tearing through the courtyard or something. That's a 10. Anxiety might be more in the range of, say, 5 to 7. It's not abject panic. It's the thing that I fear might happen,
Okay.
but I don't know. It's a future threat. So at its core, anxiety is a probabilistic assessment of future threat. It might or might not happen, but I'm worried. And that, by the way, that word worry is centrally linked to anxiety. When we're anxious, we tend to worry. What is worry? It's rehearsing in our mind the future threat that we think may or may not occur.
That's really, really helpful. And I guess then the issue of anxiety, to put it kind of conceptually, is that you are operating at a 6 out of 10 fear level for like most of your life or most of your waking moments. And the energy output and the impact that must have on your body would be crazy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's really well put, Hugh. I mean, anxiety is very costly. And it's worth the cost if it's a short-term situation, right? I mean, if we are in a situation that is potentially threatening or dangerous, then we really should be anxious. We should actually worry. It's helpful. It's adaptive. It can be life-saving. It can make all the difference for us. But it was never designed to be going off all the time.
Yeah, or for a 2-year pandemic.
Exactly right. Yeah. And that's been really, I think, the biggest mental health challenge for most of the world over the last 2 years is how can we go through something that's a once in a century, that's unprecedented, that's filled with unpredictability, that's filled with threat, that's filled with some new information that's potentially frightening. Every other week, it seems like, how can we find a baseline where we can still get down to that restorative, healthy place where, we're not just sitting there idly burning up all of our energy, all of our resources.
But in saying that, like pre-pandemic, and I only can say this like anecdotally, like way more of my friends and the people that I care about struggle with anxiety than they do depression. And what I could even see happening, if you just track from like when we left school at 18 to where my community is now, I'd say like 26, 27, 28, like anxiety has come for a lot of people. And so it seems to me that the pandemic entered stage left into an already kind of like desperate scene where anxiety was a bit of an epidemic in itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so well put. So, I'm always thinking about these things historically and even just in my own career. So I've been teaching for 25 years at the university level. 20 years ago, far and away, the most significant mental health challenge for my students was clinical depression. What happened about 10 years ago is I noticed a flip where all of a sudden now what students most wanted to hear about were the anxiety disorders. Not that they didn't still have huge interest in depression. It's still a huge, huge problem. It's just that clinical anxiety has overtaken it. It has just snowballed beyond anything that I would have ever expected. And so just to put some flesh and bones on this, some numbers on it, we now see that with today's generation of young people in the States, in Europe, roughly 1 out of 4 have already experienced a diagnosable anxiety disorder. And that was pre-pandemic. Over the last 2 years, we've seen the rates of anxiety across the entire population skyrocket, even higher. And one stat that still kind of blows me away, the biggest study that we have of this question, what happens when somebody has COVID? What does that do to their likelihood of getting an anxiety disorder? Well, we find that there's about a 2.5 times increased risk just in the couple months immediately following a COVID diagnosis. So in other words, 250% increase of anxiety disorders right after an infection.
Why do you think pre-pandemic anxiety levels were on the rise? Like you talked about that flip, and I know this could be like a PhD thesis and probably is for like some of your students, but like in your shortest, most bullet pointy form, like why do you think that flip happened? Like obviously, like my low-hanging fruit is always like, it's the screen's fault. But like, what do you think if you were kind of shooting the breeze about it?
Yeah, that's such a brilliant question. I mean, the short answer is nobody knows for sure, but there are lots of, I think, pretty compelling hypotheses about it. One, I mean, you just mentioned the screen thing, and I think I agree with you. I mean, so I've got a colleague named Jean Twenge at San Diego State, and she made the observation, I think she was the first to ever make it, that this surge of anxiety in young people almost perfectly coincides with the advent of smartphones.
Wow.
And the widespread adoption of smartphones by young people as they're growing up. And there are all kinds of reasons, of course. I mean, and we don't have to, this actually could make a really good future episode, I think.
I will talk for 6 episodes, 6 seasons about screens and social media and disconnecting. So yeah, let's go. I'm excited.
So, okay, let's just stipulate that it's not a coincidence that basically, how about this? Let's take a step back and take the big picture view. Our minds, our bodies, our brains were never designed for a world in which we're spending hour upon hour every day staring at a screen, interacting with a screen that's feeding us information that's either making us feel afraid or anxious or envious or unsettled or disoriented or outraged or enraged. So that's a lot of, not all, but a lot of what not only social media does, but also what our news does. And it's not to say that our news is, God forbid, I absolutely hate the phrase fake news. I'm just gonna go on record. I think that's a really damaging turn of phrase.
I always say with people, and I talk about this a lot whenever it comes to even the business model of podcasting, the issue is it's the business model. It's the fact that you make money through scale and you make money through clicks. And that in itself is a topsy-turvy business model that will encourage you to create a certain type of content that will be optimized for scale rather than impact, or to go wide rather than deep, as I would say.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a kind of a running joke in the US, at least for local news. The adage has always been, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if you want a newscast to grab the potential viewer, you put on the sensational, the lurid. And the way our brains are designed, we don't think very easily in probabilistic terms. We don't think, okay, well, in a planet of 7.5 to 8 billion people, every day there's going to be something upsetting. In fact, many upsetting things. But that doesn't give us a sense of the fact that it's vanishingly improbable that any of those things is going to happen to us right now or anybody we know.
It's a great point.
Our ancestors, if we go back into deep history, like over 10,000 years ago, everybody on the planet was a hunter-gatherer. Everybody on the planet lived they were on a lifelong camping trip with their 30 to 50 closest friends and relatives. And when they got news, I'm so glad we're talking about this. This makes me really happy. When our ancestors got news of anything bad, it actually shifted their assessment of the risk level in their world in a real way.
It was coming to a neighborhood near you. If you hear, what's a crazy example? If you hear like there's a pack of wolves in the neighboring village, you're like, oh my goodness, like hide your kids, get the spears, let's go.
Yeah. I mean, if anything bad happened to anybody in your world 10,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, it meant your world objectively got more dangerous. So you needed to worry. You needed to pay attention. We still have the same software running in our brains, except now we're being bombarded with a constant flood of information saying, hey, Grok over in that next village over. Oh, well, actually it's 10,000 miles away, but never mind. Your brain thinks it's the next village over. Grok had this horrible thing happen and you need to be scared. And, now put us in a pandemic. And you can see that the recipe for news consumption and social media consumption driving anxiety at levels that we were really, not fully equipped to deal with. And so we're going to have to be rather clever, I think, to be able to find peace. Can I use a fancy word, Hugh?
Oh, please.
To find
That's why you're here. Come on.
Yeah, everybody. I can already reflexively see the eyes rolling. Equanimity. I love that word. Equanimity, the tranquility, that sense of like, how can we find, oh, wait, it gets better. Equipoise. How can we find that in the midst of this really unsettling situation? I genuinely believe it's possible, but I think it doesn't come naturally to most of us. We're really going to have to work at it.
I'll give you a crazy example. So I think I mentioned to you before that Ireland is a little bit like a village in the terms that everybody knows everybody. And, you went to school with somebody's mother's, cousins, grannies, cats, dogs sort of situation. And, you'll meet anybody and you can...
You have cats and dogs in school? Is that...
Yeah, we're way more progressive than America,
I love it, yeah.
And there was a unnamed media outlet in Northern Ireland, and they actually had this COVID postcode checker where you could type in your zip code just to translate, and it would show you like all of the neighborhoods around you and like where the cases were and everything like that. And it was just like, whoa, the level of anxiety that this pandemic provokes in people organically, never mind whenever people kind of fine tune and hone in to amplify that fear for like a monetary purpose is just crazy. So we talked last episode about how the virus itself, because it is kind of two separate things at this point. There is the virus of COVID-19, and then there is like the consequences or the effects or the restrictions or the response to COVID-19. Now I got there in the end. I cycled through the response. We talked how there was a strong link between the virus and depression. What's going on with anxiety? Is it something similar or is it different? Is there no connection?
Well, we talked last week, and so we'll invite you, dear listener, to go back and take a deep dive with us. Last week, we talked about inflammation. So inflammation is just part of the body's immune reaction to an infection. And when we're fighting COVID, we mount an astonishingly powerful immune response. And that's great insofar as it goes, but it can leave our immune system in a state of dysregulation where it's been a little bit freaked out and we have way too much inflammation. And the problem is that the inflamed brain is a brain that is on full tilt, runaway stress response. So if I can just make it really short, pithy, understandable, the virus can push us into a state of inflammation that leaves us feeling incredibly anxious. And oftentimes the person who's having that reaction, it's not like they can just point to something and say, oh, here's what I'm worried about. It's just, I just feel this incredible anxiety. And then, by the way, when we're feeling anxious, our minds are now in a mode of being hypervigilant to threat. So we'll find something to worry about. It's kind of a subtle point, but I think it's an important one to validate. If we make somebody biologically anxious, as the virus can do, they will then become psychologically anxious because the mind is going to follow along with the brain. They're going to find something to worry about, something to ruminate about, well, even if they weren't.
If the fire alarm goes off, you look for fire, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And someday we'll talk about panic disorder when people have, these just completely out of the blue, unexpected 5-alarm fires go off in their body and brains. And, it's something their brain is doing to them. But while it's happening, they're searching around for like, well, something horrible must be happening. I don't see it in my environment. There's no crazed madman coming at me. So maybe I'm dying. Maybe I'm going crazy. Maybe I'm about to pass out, right? They'll find something to fill in the blanks about why they're having that reaction.
It's just crazy to me, just like the depression conversation we had, how on a biological level, it makes us vulnerable and it removes some of our kind of built-in defenses. Because as I've said to you before, I always come at this sort of stuff. I always come at the mental health world before meeting you from like the emotional side or like the psychological side or like the spiritual side, like, you know, what's going on like inside our thinking brains rather than our physical brain. And one of the biggest game changers for me has been actually deploying my physical body and giving my physical body a chance to kind of soup itself up to fight some of these things. But there were like physical disruptions to our everyday lives. You know, like I mentioned at the start of the show, even simply like as a podcaster, I had to overnight pivot into remote interviewing. Like I'd never done a remote interview until that point. Isn't that crazy?
I know. I had never taught a class remote.
Wow.
I had never seen a therapy patient.
I didn't know what Zoom was. Imagine that, a world without Zoom. It seems unfathomable.
Can we please have a world without Zoom?
Yeah, you know, like whenever we write fairy tales for our for the next generation, it will be like about these mystical times where you didn't have telecommunication, you know, you didn't have things like Zoom. So just before we kind of get into the actionable things, the brief little things we're going to cover today, because as Steve said, we're going to do a full deep dive into anxiety in a future episode. I like to think, whether it's anxiety or anger or any sort of thought pattern that's happening in your head, a little bit like a staircase, or a little bit, because, you know, we've all heard the term like you spiral out of control, and it's always comes with like negative connotations where you're always seem to be spiraling out of control rather than spiraling into control. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, that's good.
Something that actually really helped me, and this is not mine, it was shared with me like a few years ago, and it's something I use visually in my mind all the time, is it's a little bit like a spiral staircase where actually you can spiral upwards and you can also spiral downwards, and it's a little bit of a sliding scale. And I think with so much thought pattern activity happening in our brain, the secret is to try to stop the spiral downwards. So that's the first step. And then the second step is, okay, what are the things I could do to start to walk back up the stairs towards peace, or towards a state of tranquility, or whatever kind of lovely fancy word you want to put on it. And so for me, some of the things we share today are going to be kind of like pattern interrupts, where it's like, let's do something that stops us in our tracks, that kind of gives us that reset moment so we don't spiral any further. And then I think there's future things we can do to start to climb our way back up that staircase.
Yeah, I think that's a really vivid image. Just the idea, I tell you what was in my head as you said that is basically just unwinding the downward spiral, right? So not just hitting the pause button, but now, you know, hitting reverse and watching that whole scene sort of reverse itself and unwind itself. And so that's a really vivid image of an upward spiral. Also, by the way, there's a self-help book called The Upward Spiral.
Oh, dude, the words on my lips were, dude, we should write a book called The Upward Spiral.
Yeah. Well, somebody already beat us to the punch.
Oh, man.
So what we're going to do today is really just very quickly go through three things that hopefully there'll be three little tools, little strategies that we're hoping, if you've been finding yourself struggling with anxiety, struggling with runaway stress, struggling with your mental health. These are things that all of us can adopt right away that really can make a difference and hopefully can move the needle a bit in our minds and in our brains. So the first thing, our reflexive response all too often is to start ruminating. To basically, I love that word, by the way, rumination, just to brood, to dwell, to turn that negative thinking over and over and over again, just to perseverate on it and not let go. And the longer we brood, the longer we ruminate, the more it amplifies our stress response. It amplifies the intensity of our emotions. And it's really, really toxic. You know, I think that first and foremost, then back to your question, what kind of tools can we leave listeners with this week? First tool, notice when you're ruminating. Notice, just basically become, here's a buzzy word, become more mindful. Start to notice what you're noticing. Start to think about what you're thinking about. Notice if you're ruminating and then make a conscious decision, I've got to redirect my attention onto something else. I got to get out of my head right now. How about that? I've got to get out of my head and get back out into the world of other people and meaningful activities, because that's what I was ultimately designed to be doing, not to be brooding.
It's probably not a great metaphor or a great connection, but whenever you first introduced me to like rumination in your book, The Depression Cure, I kind of always, and maybe this was your metaphor, maybe I'm just totally about to like plagiarize you here, but I always like brought it back to cows. Maybe that's just a very Irish thing, or maybe that's something that you actually
Yes.
wrote. But
yeah, they're ruminant animals.
yeah, you know, so they chew on the grass and then they swallow it and then they bring it back up again and they chew it again. I think pretty sure giraffes are the same. And that image was been so helpful for me because, like, just for full disclosure, like the whole rumination thing, even if I was like reading it in your book, it was a section that I was like, yeah, this isn't really for me. This isn't really my thing. Like, let me get to the quote unquote good stuff. But it came into force really helpfully, actually in a different way, where I was dealing with really intense anger. So I had, what's a nice anonymous way to say this? I had friction in a key relationship in my life. There you go. That's nice and big.
Well put.
There you go.
Wow.
And very
you could
diplomatic.
be a diplomat.
Yeah.
Yes, you could be a diplomat. You may have missed your calling. After the whole podcast thing runs its course.
I always think, whenever I retire, I could be like some sort of Irish ambassador in like Barbados or something. It's possible. Like we could find a way to make it work. But I found myself like doing the classic, going back to like the arguments or going back and replaying scenarios. And it just helped me because I was like, dude, you're just regurgitating your grass. Like, stop it. Like, put it away. Actually, something that I started to do, and this was on the advice of a friend. He is someone that has struggled with anxiety a lot. And we work together on quite a few things. He kind of has this thing. He used to be a smoker. And he's like, okay, imagine like you light the cigarette. You take a big like inhale. You're like, then you hold it. And then you let it go. And he's like, whenever you're inhaling, like in the, you're like, okay, I'm going to think about this thing for like the next 5 seconds, and then as soon as the exhale comes, I'm gonna literally let it leave my body. And after the exhale, you take the cigarette and you just flick it out of your hand. And it sounds so stupid, but sometimes I'll be driving in my car and I'll notice myself regurgitating something and getting that anger kind of coming in again. And I'll just do that quick little drag, exhale, and then flick. And when you flick it, it's like, okay, I'm done thinking about this for now. I'm not gonna dip back into that argument or into that tension, and I'm going to move on with the rest of my day. So I don't know if that's going to land or not.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. When Hugh first told me about this metaphor, I laughed in his face. I was not very polite. I was trying to be polite. I was trying to be diplomatic, but I'm not as diplomatic as Hugh. And I just thought, I don't know, man. I thought you were going to go in a direction of diaphragmatic breathing, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But, okay, here's the deal. I'm liking it a lot more. So let me tell you what I like about it. First of all, I like the fact that it worked for you. Okay,
yeah. Well, ultimately, wisdom's proven by its results, bro, okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. I like the fact that it was a tool for mindfulness, for not only noticing, okay, I'm doing the thing, I'm brooding. In this case, you were ruminating on anger related thoughts. And we've all been there and done that, right? I mean, it's very captivating, also really toxic. So, you did a little bit of a deep breathing technique, which we're going to talk about in a minute, actually powerfully engages a part of the nervous system that kind of puts the brakes on that stress response. So that's really wise and therapeutic. And then you embodied your thought process by flicking it away. So there's a whole really super trendy kind of thing that we'll probably talk about sometime in the next 6 months of embodied cognition and how important many therapists are finding working with the patient's bodies around, especially trauma and other difficult things that happen to us that don't just make an imprint in our mind, but also we sort of carry them around sometimes in our bodies. So the fact that you're getting your body involved and flicking the symbolic thought away like a cigarette is actually now bringing brain circuits into play. We would call them more sensory motor circuits that are part of the backbone of how we organize our mental experience. And so that symbolic action of flicking it away, actually, it's growing on me, Hugh. I got to admit, I did laugh in your face. But
I wasn't sure if I was setting myself for a broken heart as well as a broken nose, but I'm glad you're either coming around to it or else you're just being very gracious to me because the red light's on.
No, I think you get the last laugh on this one. By the way, how is your nose?
Oh my goodness, mate! I didn't even tell you. So, I mean, for the listeners' benefit, the TLDR, the too long didn't read, or in this case, too long didn't listen. I mentioned last episode that I broke my nose playing basketball, which is a very American thing. So that's kind of cool, relatability and all that sort of stuff spikes through the roof when you say stuff like
mad
that.
Props.
Yeah. Props. And I had basically this crazy scenario where I was flat out with work because I had COVID the month before, and I was leaving for Germany to spend Christmas with my wife's family. And I had 1 week to get my nose fixed, and I had 1 day actually to get it fixed, and that was a Friday just before we flew. And it was either get it fixed then or wait a month when we were in Germany and then come back with a very healed, very wonky nose. So I rocked up to my appointment at the ENT or whatever, and they sat me down and they were like, "What happened?" Da, da, da. And they're like, "Yeah, that is a really wonky nose." And I was like, "Yeah, it is. Please fix it." So they said, "Okay, this isn't the news that you want to hear, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do it today. It's broken in 2 places. You're going to have to come back and be put under anesthetic, and we'll get it fixed that way." And I looked at the dude dead in his face. And again, this is so out of character for me because I'm not a tough guy. And I was like, "Could you do it for me right now?" And he kind of looked at me and he goes, "Well, technically speaking, yes, but I wouldn't recommend it." And I was like, "But would you do it? If I asked you to?" And he goes, "I mean, we could try to do the first bit, and if it was too much, then you could come back for the second bit at another time." I was like, no, I need this done now. So the long and the short of it is, I had to get it re-broken in 2 different places. The first bit, as you would imagine, where they're holding on to the wonky part and ramming it back into place. But I didn't know this. So I had a dent in my nose where it had collapsed in towards my skull. So he went up through my nostril and basically tried to poke the dent out again, like you would to an old car or something. And
like he's pounding out a car fender.
Yeah, I was like, "What the heck is going on?" But in and out, probably 25 minutes. I went out, my wife picked me up, and we drove to the airport the next day, and here we are. And my nose is good as new. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Dear listener, you did not know that you were in the company of greatness, badass greatness here. I'm really uncharacteristically speechless listening because I'm there's no way they did this. Wait, you were not under anesthetic.
No, I didn't.
You were not out.
I didn't get anything because I had a limited time frame, and they were like, "Okay, well, let's do this the old-fashioned way. Do you want something to bite down on?" So yeah, that's my re-breaking of the nose story. It should be the end of the saga. Back to diaphragmatic breathing. Is that what you said? That's a word that I really had to be intentional with.
Yeah. It doesn't just kind of roll off the tongue, but it's...
What was the word you used earlier? The 2 versions of it?
Equipoise. Equanimity and equipoise.
So equanimity, I was like, yeah. When you pulled out the equipoise, I was like, whoa, that sounds like a Pokemon, bro.
So the diaphragm is, and I know that may have other associations for that word for some listeners, but the diaphragm in the human body is the smooth muscle tissue that sits right below the lungs. And it is the relaxation and contraction of the diaphragm that are the primary drivers of our breathing, and especially deep breathing, that really deep breath that just fills your lungs. Here's the amazing thing, is when the diaphragm fully deploys like that. And how do you know when it's deploying? When your belly pooches out like a baby that's lying on its back, breathing happily. It's just relaxed. And you see, babies and little toddlers, they have no self-consciousness in not even one bone in their bodies. And so they don't worry about, oh, is this going to make my tummy look fat or something? They just let it all hang out. And their belly pooches out because they're really relaxed and their diaphragm is fully deployed. And that sends a powerful signal all the way up through the spinal cord, all the way up to the brain stem and into the brain that says, hey, we're relaxed. Put the brakes on anything stress related. For those keeping score at home, this is the vagus nerve, which is the main branch of the so-called parasympathetic nervous system. That's the part of the nervous system that is the companion, the regulator to what we've sometimes here referred to as the sympathetic nervous system, which is the branch that runs on adrenaline, that revs us up. That's the fight or flight part of the nervous system. So anyway, there's a long-winded way of saying the easiest way to hack into your nervous system and put the brakes on your stress response is to get your diaphragm engaged. And it's just a very specific technique of breathing. Every trained singer has been trained in diaphragmatic breathing. Every swimmer, every yoga meister, and increasingly clinicians and their patients. Why? Because diaphragmatic breathing, in 5 minutes, we can drop our pulse rate dramatically. We can drop our blood pressure dramatically. We can drop our circulating stress hormones. And we're going to have a link in the show notes to a talented young clinician who happens to be a certified yoga instructor. Full disclosure, she happens to be my daughter.
I wasn't sure if you were gonna do the family reveal, and I was like, whoa, he's really bigging this woman up here.
Yeah. But I'm such the proud papa. She's just about finished with her training as a counseling psychologist. She's also, like I said, a yoga instructor. And I know this is Papa talking, but I did a training workshop for 200 psychologists some months ago, and I was just looking for a good 5-minute diaphragmatic breathing training on YouTube to link them to. And I thought, well, surely there's got to be something great on YouTube. I mean, it's freaking YouTube after all, right? After an hour, I was like, there's nothing that I really like here. So I called up my daughter. I said, hey, would you record me a 5-minute diaphragmatic breathing training? Within a half hour, she had it already recorded, uploaded, and it was so good. It was jaw dropping. So anyway, we're going to link to that.
Well, I can't wait to check it out, because other than to jump in and make that comment about the family, since you started talking about the diaphragmatic breathing and you mentioned the big belly pooching out, which I love the way you phrased that, I muted my mic and I've been doing it. And I have to say, I had my hand on my heart and I really did feel my heart start to slow down. And I would do a little bit of breathwork stuff with some of the cold water exposure and the therapy that I do. Which is just a fancy word for jumping in a wheelie bin filled with ice water, or, swimming in the sea.
Yeah.
We do a lot of breath work before that. And, it's like when you go swimming, even I'm not a big swimmer, but one of the things I like about it is it's just it's a free, breathing meditation workout. Do you know what I mean? Because you're doing the physical, but then you're also getting the breath stuff as well. And what I love about any type of breath work, and especially this one, is that, it sounds like a bit of a lofty tool. It sounds like a little bit of a yoga meister, which I loved as well when you said that, because it made me think of Jägermeister, which are two very, very different things.
Different strategies for reducing anxiety.
Exactly.
I would recommend the former over the latter generally.
Yeah, but this is something that you can do. Unlike taking Jägermeister, you can do while you're driving. You can do while you're sitting, waiting for an appointment. I actually started doing a little bit of breath stuff whenever I put my daughter to bed at night time. She's a year and a half, and she takes a little bit of time to get over. And sometimes I use that time just to do a little bit of breath, a little bit of meditation sort of stuff. So it's something that you can squeeze into your day quite nicely. Maybe even whenever you're watching TV or watching a movie. Of course, you can go full yogi on us and do it in silence. But I think, as long as you do it in some shape or form, it can make a big difference.
I love it. Yeah. Every once in a while, when I'm really having one of those days, I will set the timer on an app on my phone for 5 minutes, and we'll just sit there and do diaphragmatic breathing. Now, the really next level exercise is I have a biometric monitoring ring.
Of course you do.
You've heard me brag about it. My Aura ring, Oura. I have no financial connection with the company.
Although we wish we did. Aura, come on,
if that ever happens, dear listener, we will make a full disclosure. But anyway, where was? Oh yeah. So my Aura app allows me to not only do the 5-minute thing that it will time for me, it will show me my heart rate, and the next level thing, it will show me real-time EKG information, electrocardiogram information about so-called heart rate variability, which is a fancy way of saying if your brain is hitting on all cylinders, it will slow down your heart when you're exhaling and speed it up when you're inhaling, because that's the most efficient thing.
Wow.
And when people are healthy and young and rested, their HRV, heart rate variability, is very nimble and agile, and it's this huge number. And as people age and as they get unwell and as they get stressed, the HRV plummets. And I love watching my HRV go way, way, way up into very youthful territory when I do 5 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing. So how's that? That's a cool little life hack.
It's therapeutic on many levels, Steve, isn't it?
Yeah, you had to go there, but yes, it is. It is. I can have the illusion of a little taste of youthfulness. So you had one more thing you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched it, but I wanted to talk about media fasting. And this is maybe where we are slightly on maybe different ends of the spectrum. But what I would say is that constant exposure to the absolute barrage of information just doesn't suit me and my brain well. And what I've found really helpful is to trust and accept that there are people like you in the world who are on top of this thing, who have years and years of medical experience and expertise, who can actually make tangible findings and differences with this knowledge. Whereas for me, I'm just kind of filling my head with knowledge that I can't really deploy in my own personal life. You know, you mentioned the treasure that each of us have to share to our community and to our families. You know, I focus on what I can do, what is inside my control, and that is to be a better podcaster and connect better with my guests, and to be a better father, and to be a better husband, and be a better friend. And I can kind of outsource my media consumption to you. Yes. And I think every kind of tribe has someone like you. Like, we have a dude in our friendship group, and he is like, we call him Mr. Spreadsheet. Because for any purchase, I mean, like something as small as, like, say, a new water bottle, he will do the deep dive and, you know, compare like 10 different models and kind of rate them on a scale. And so we outsource all of our like mid to low level purchasing to this guy. We're like, Robin, what water bottle do you use? You know what I mean? Or it's like, or even like a car. It's like, you know, what cars were you looking at when you were considering? Because we just know it'll save us like the 3-month deep dive on it. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's the way a tribe is. That's the way a tribe is supposed to work, right? Is that everybody gets to have their own thing, their own power that they bring to the tribe. It's like, hey, this is my thing, and I'm so joyful to be able to offer this to others and to have them appreciate it, at least sometimes, right, and value it. So,
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I love that perspective.
The other thing that I'll say is just like really basic actionable takeaway on this department is, you know, I'm a big believer in creating a buffer at the start of the day and the end of the day with your screen and with your consumption of nearly just about anything, from food to information to any type of stimulation, I suppose. For me, the gold standard is if you can spend an hour after waking up away from your screen and an hour before you go to sleep, like that is just something for me that has exponential impact on my own sense of well-being, my own sense of calm, even my ability to think and my ability to like think my own thoughts, which might sound a bit strange. But so that, and you know, if you're not there, I do a lot of work with young people in a voluntary capacity, and you know, we're often encouraging them, you know, even if you can just do 30 minutes for the first few months and kind of build your way up to it, I think it's definitely worth doing. The other thing then is we take a 24-hour every single week Sabbath as such, away from our screens and away from the consumption of media, and that also makes a big difference. And then if you wanted to take it to the next level, you know, we would try to take certain like holiday time, so vacation time, of longer periods of time where it's maybe 3 to 5 to maybe even a 7 day around Christmas and in the summertime, where we are completely disconnected and off the grid. There's still ways for people to contact us if they need to.
Yeah.
But
okay, Hugh, I just want to point out that like 99% of our listeners are like, "What the hell, man?" like, wait, what? A week away from? Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, that's really radical. It's countercultural. It's very wise. I think it's aspirational. How about? And I think we ought to return to that. Maybe, somewhere down the road.
Scale, I think, like you say, like even for someone like yourself, like you gotta have at least some time away from it in order to see, the trees clearly from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hey, and I want to just drop one thing for listeners, because it just occurred to me that there's some of you out there, you don't have a person in your tribe that you really trust to provide really reliable, scientifically valid, savvy information about the pandemic. And there is someone who is playing that role out in the public space who I regard as a national and international treasure. I don't know him. I follow him on Twitter. I read his Substack, and I just want to put him on your radar because he's a genius. His name is Dr. Eric Topol, Topol. And he's a cardiologist. He's an MD, but more than anything, he is a gifted communicator with the public of reliable medical information. He's not an alarmist. He's very balanced. He doesn't have what I regard as any sort of political agenda other than to do no harm. He's a doctor after all, and to best communicate exactly what is happening with the virus as it mutates, what's happening with the pandemic, what's happening with different public health measures, with vaccines. If you have questions, this guy is right at the top of my list of the first person. I mean, when Omicron broke, he was literally the first person I turned to. So just to keep it in mind, if you're going to follow one person, that would be the one.
And I love that because, throughout the pandemic, there has been a lot of naysayers and a lot of sources of negativity and a lot of sources of fear. And, I love that you give that example of, Gandalf, aka Topol, doing his thing where you can actually go to as a trusted place. And, it's also a source of hope that the pandemic, there will be an end to it. Who knows when that end will happen, but there will be an end. They always end.
That's a mantra for me. Every time I face anyone in my life, and it's been a lot of students that are so discouraged that we're 2 years in and it's still going. And it's just like, look, every pandemic does end. Mm-hmm. This will end. And we're all ready for it to have ended a year ago or more. But it will end. And it's just so important to hold on to that sense of hope. We're not in the same situation we were in last year.
Yeah.
We're not the same people we were this time last year or 2 years ago when the pandemic started. And many of us, I hope all of us, are going to be in a healthier, more thriving state a year from now.
And I think it's important to also underscore that element of hope that you were talking about. And I do want to call back to the start of the episode where we said that, none of us has handled this perfectly. None of us have done this 100%. And I really think that the shame or the guilt about the past or any sort of failure that we think that we've had on our own part, or areas that we've maybe not taken care of ourselves in regards to anxiety, not to beat ourselves up about it, and not to use it as an excuse to become even more fearful, but just to kind of have this moment where, we take a breath, we take a diaphragmatic breath, as it were.
Nice.
Yeah, you like that? And we look back with reflection, with curiosity, because there's really key lessons that I've learned in my own mental health journey over the last 2 years. And in some ways, the pandemic, I think, has accelerated my own discovery and understanding of myself and of my own depression and other things that I struggle with. And so I think there is, that is the opportunity, that is the hope as we go forward into the rest of these episodes and into future episodes on anxiety, where, it's all fuel for the fire. It's all important, useful building blocks that we can hopefully build a bigger and better foundation that we can walk forward stronger together on. I sounded a little bit like a politician there, didn't I?
You know what? It's just so eloquent. I love that you're using a podcast as a training ground for a future career pivot.
Vote for Hugh 20, and I'll go for the US presidency somehow. I'll find a way to make that work, and it'll be vote Hugh James 2046 or something. I don't know.
Let's go. Just to build on what you were saying, I've got a talk coming up next month, and the title they gave me, here's my mandate: Thriving in the Pandemic and Beyond.
Oh, dude.
And that's a lot of what we're about here, right?
We
want to help.
4?
Absolutely. Thriving in the pandemic and beyond. The foundation that we put into practice while we're in the storm of a global pandemic, that foundation will be with us even as we move forward. And so the habits that we cultivate now, hopefully, are going to be habits that last a lifetime, and we're going to see dividends. So that, I'm a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm going to look for the silver lining. And that's the one that I've found. And that's the one that we really want to lean into.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for listening today. Really appreciate you joining us on this short journey through anxiety and how it was kind of connected to the pandemic. And as I said, I hope that you're excited to join with us and kind of buckle up for the next few episodes through the rest of the series. And then as we jump into Anxiety 101 in a few months' time as well for the quote-unquote deep dive into this subject as well. And what else do I need to say? Yeah, mentalhealth.fm is the website. That's where you can kind of dial into the show notes from today. Steve mentioned a few things. I mentioned a few things. We'll have that diaphragmatic breathing video and everything else that we mentioned. So it's in a easy, clickable, fast way for you to access this stuff. The website is also the place where you can get in touch with us. We have a fancy little contact form where you can send us feedback or suggestions or ideas. I also, Steve, I haven't told you about this. I found like a pretty sweet plugin where people can submit voice messages and voice notes. Nice. If you want to submit even questions for us, I'm sure we'd love to do like a Q&A episode.
Yeah, totally going to happen. And we'll play little audio clips maybe even.
That's the thing, we'd love to get with people's permission, voice in episodes. So yeah, look, I really hope you enjoyed that. I had a blast. And Steve, even just for you, man, like, thanks for this. I always learn a ton whenever we hang out. And I really look forward to catching you again next week.
Oh, thanks so much, man. This has been a blast, as always. And thank you, everyone who joined us today. It's a privilege to be with you. We wish you a great week. Until next time, be well.